Integrating the good girl. Good girl doesn't feel okay with just doing nothing. She feels this sense that she needs to do because it was coded in her nervous system that she's lazy if she doesn't do. Good girl doesn't own what she wants. She's scared to ask for what she wants. She thinks, okay, if I just do this, this, and that, I'll get a little bit of this, a little bit of love, a little bit fed, if that's okay. If that's okay with you. So the good girl is not like victim girl or outraged girl. Good girl is trying to appease everybody around her. She's being okay with less than what she wants. Good girl needs to start feeding herself first and foremost. Good girl wants more than what she's getting from others. Good girl owns that she needs to be treated like this. Good girl gets to embody being totally provided for and cared for without having to do anything because she's already worthy. Good girl needs sexually liberated. Good girl needs to be fucked. She needs to feel like she's not a dirty, rotten sinner for being sensual or sexual with herself. Good girl needs to morph into the wolf in her. She needs to have a fire. She needs to have a backbone. Good girl needs to own her primal, her assertive parts of her that for now has been totally repressed, rejected. She hasn't been allowed to access those parts of her. So what fires up good girl with truth and conviction? Good girl gets to finally access her anger, her sacred rage. Because good girl is not one for really displaying her anger. Good girl looks at outraged girl and thinks, well, she's a mess. Like, that's not going to be good for me, screaming and erupting all over the place. Good girl really shames that part of outraged girl. And outraged girl thinks good girl is a bit of a loser. Like, why don't you just express yourself? Poor good girl. We all have these parts of ourselves. And instead of repressing them, they just want to be loved into wholeness and fully expressed. So good girl gets to find a space for her anger, for her wildness. And good girl starts practicing in real life, like, hey, yeah, that's not okay. And say no. And stand up for herself. Good girl gets to lean into outraged girl. Because outraged girl is so good at expressing the fury. Because outraged girl is so good at showing just how fucking mad she is and pissed off. But good girl can teach outraged girl, like, hey, there's a time and a place. And taking more accountability, the part that I play in this situation. Where outraged girl is more like, no, you did this. And good girl is more like me, so they can like learn from each other. Good girl needs to face her fears. She will talk about them. She will ruminate about them like over and over and over. Good girl is like, I don't want to be too much. Oh, I'm scared. So good girl has a fear of being like too much, not enough, rejected. She has a fear of not getting it right, being quote bad. She has a fear of failing in life and being completely humiliated. Good girl fears being reprimanded, being misunderstood. And so good girl gets to die as they're integrated into wholeness. All of these girls do. The invisible girl, the outraged girl, victim girl. And it's not just one session, boom, they died. No, it's like invisible girl comes up for me. the most in Good Girl, they all come up for me. Little 7-year-old Amanda, trying to be good, terrified of conflict, scared of her parents' rage, wants to speak up but is scared. So Good Girl needs to face her fear of abandonment, her fears of conflict, like face it. And there's going to be a lot of resistance to that. Integrating these shadow girls, you get to live fully alive, without fear. It's like masking who you really are, because who you really are didn't work in the past. Growing up, I got the imprint that who I am doesn't work. It's not acceptable. And so I pretzel myself into what I think I need to be. And so her work is, as she faces her pain, Good Girl has a fear of being a bad girl. This doesn't mean Good Girl becomes the bad girl. It just means it's not so black and white. It's not so, oh, I can't do this, or I can't do that. She can still be so kind, living from her heart, wearing her heart on her sleeve, and giving and generous. She doesn't have to lose her superpower. She just gets to integrate into wholeness, so she's no longer getting taken advantage of by others, by energy vampires who just take and take and take from her. She's no longer in the bedroom and feeling used. Good Girl is allowed to use her voice, to take up space, to have an opinion, to be here in the world. I only knew what wasn't allowed. Like, I was punished if I used my voice, if I had an opinion. I was shut down. Like, okay, I need to follow these set of rules and keep myself good and try to be perfect. So Good Girl learned, like, if she wants a thing, she needs to learn how to play by the rules. Like, it's like forced obedience. The pandemic was a perfect example. Restrictions were put in place, and it was really hard for a Good Girl to follow her truth. Oh, Good Girl, if you want to work, you better go get your shot. So Good Girl is so young. She's so young. There's a naivety to Good Girl, because Good Girl doesn't really face her grief or her pain. And this is the maturing process. There's a prison of the government. There's a prison of living in a narcissistic dynamic. If you weren't conditioned or programmed to be a certain way, how would you be? How would you live? How would you dress your body? How would you walk? How would you move? Who would you date? I would have learned this earlier, because for so long I was embarrassed that I even had needs and desires and emotions. And look, I'm being such a good girl. I'm repressing all of my emotions, my grief. I'm just gonna go completely invisible. And this is where a visible girl comes in. To then fuck all of this, I'm just gonna be a bad girl, to partying, dating emotionally unavailable men all the time. I could have reparented Good Girl sooner if I would have known these teachings. Good Girl is desperately yearning for mothering and fathering that she didn't get. So how are we parenting ourselves to her? Are we criticizing her the whole time? Are we nice to her? How do I view the part of me that is the good girl? That's where we start. The neural pathway is, if you are confined and restricted, you are safer. So Good Girl gets to totally rewire that. So Good Girl gets to embody standing up for herself, listening to her intuition, saying no, having a backbone. That is where she's safe. So let's take Good Girl as if she's like a little girl, maybe 12. She's just about to start like her period. Let's take her and reteach her the womanly ways. Power, that she holds. That's the work for good girl.